Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining today's lesson on Santa's first iterative macro. This course will be an introduction to iterative macros. So if this is your first time building it, hopefully we give you some insight and then also accompany it with somewhat of a festive background. First off, I'd like to apologize for any issues that you had getting into the room. There was some issues with our time zones and some dates. So for those of you who are able to make it, it's great. For those of you who are probably viewing this as a recording, we apologize. So a few housekeeping notes before I move any forward. By default, everybody is muted, so I will not be able to hear you if you are asking any questions. Instead, I'd recommend that you go to the Q&A panel within WebEx and enter your question in there. And I'll be monitoring that periodically throughout the presentation, so if there's a certain question that's apropos at the moment, I'll try to answer it or follow up at the end with it. All right, without further ado, let's just jump into some of the concepts. Now, I will say before we get started, if you go to community.alteryx.com through the same link that you probably got here today in the live training, there is an attached workflow. So let me click in here. Santa's first iterative macro. It is in 11.7 right now, but if you do download it, you can extract some of the data files that are associated with it, and then you can follow along, or if you just like to watch, you feel free to do so. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and download it, or just feel free to watch. So what we're going to be working with today is I'm positioning myself as Santa Claus and trying to make data-driven decisions as to how I should best optimize my delivery route. And we could go really deep with this, but I'm going to create the most simplistic analysis that I can for Santa Claus so we don't get too deep into Alteryx too fast. Simply, I just have a list of all my children I need to deliver presents to in the United States, and I need to basically determine which order I do it, because I don't want to be flying from Washington. If I followed names alphabetically, right, I could just be flying from Washington to Washington, D.C., to Maine, to Florida, and not in any particular order that really makes sense. So that's where we're going to step into our macro today, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more about our approach. So what is an iterative macro? Okay, it's a process that you want to repeat again and again and again. It could be accomplished using the same set of tools over and over and over again, but you might find that really expensive to get to some certain point. So we're going to show you how to create this self-ending loop, like an if-then loop, until some sort of criteria is met, and then the output of the macro will be presented. Iterative macros, as you know, within Designer there are 3 types of macros. Iterative is arguably one of the most difficult to work with because it's not automatically detected, and there's a little bit more configuration that goes around it beyond just the workflow. So in order to make a macro iterative, you need to go to your workflow configuration inside your canvas and change it to that type. So if I were to bring in my Designer really quick and open a new canvas, by default, any new canvas starts as a standard workflow. If I want it to be an iterative macro, I need to click on this macro toggle and select iterative macro. Now I'll show that most of the time, what do I mean by is it automatically detected? If I start dropping macro style tools onto the canvas, if I were to go back here, I would see that it automatically detects to a standard macro. If I were to drop a certain tool that's only associated with batch macros and go back to the workflow, it would change to batch macro, right? But there is nothing that I can drop on the canvas that will automatically make it change to iterative macro, which is why I'm saying it's not automatically detected. So you'll always, before your iterative macro begins building, want to click into iterative macro to make sure that file type is set. Okay, and this is important later on because it exposes new variables within your workflow, mainly this iteration number. So it can tell you how many times it's looped through your logic before it returns on a certain result. And that's not available with any or with standard macros, as an example, to see that variable disappear. Okay. So iterations, as I just talked about, just talks about how many times you loop through your logic. The first pass through your iterative macro will always start at 0. So if you want to say your first pass is 1, you always have to make sure that your iteration is +1. Okay. And again, that'll become a little bit more clear once we start building our macro. Okay, we'll skip over this real quick. Here's a great example of someone, it may be a customer example or a dummy example, who wanted to build out some sort of analysis saying, when will my investment reach a certain threshold, let's say 5K, right? So they would actually add the interest rate and filter to see if it's done yet, add in the interest rate again to that past one, and you can see there's the same set of do a calculation, check if it's past 5,000, do a calculation, check if it's past 5,000. And they did it so many times, right, until they get to this final output, and hopefully somewhere along the way, one of these works. Now you can see this can become somewhat of a nightmare to work with when it comes to building out your designer, when really in an iterative macro, you could just build these two tools and tell them to keep repeating until that 5,000 threshold was met. Okay? So here's an example of what that looks like. In this case, we're looking at the investment amount times the actual 5% of interest gained, or I guess investment amount, and then see when it actually ends with less than 2,000, right? And you'll see that by this logic, some of the records loop and some of them exit out the end, okay? This is what we mean by iterative, and I'll play that back, okay? So we can designate within the Alteryx designer how one input should map back to the input, right? So I can tell one loop to keep going, and if it's ever less than 2,000, just exit, you're done, right? So for any dot that you see going out this way, it represents that it's actually less than 2,000, while the rest of them keep looping. It may not have completed by a certain threshold. Maybe we said 500 rounds of investment, and they still didn't reach less than 2,000. So we can output those leftover records on another side. Or you could just keep looping them until they reach there, if that makes sense. Okay? We'll cover this. It's a little not super helpful in a slide, so we'll just leave it as is for now. So let's just jump over to our designer and go ahead and get started. Okay? So I'm going to click out of all these new workflows here. Let me just, I'll do one more new one here. Okay. So let's go ahead and connect to our file. I'm going to go ahead and click on US Santa stops. If I'm going to add a browse to that, we'll take a quick peek at what's involved in this data set. So you can see here I have a recipient ID. We can see latitude, longitude, city, state, and country. No one knew when Santa was checking his list twice, he was using recipient IDs. We always thought they were nice names, right? So anyway, we're going to be working with recipient IDs, but essentially this represents a child, right? A unique child to receive gifts from Santa Claus. And what we want to do is create some sort of logic that says, hey, starting with whatever recipient this is, what's the next closest recipient to this location, right? Because the next closest one makes sense. It's the next shortest stop. And then let's say this one happens to be the next closest, right? So who's the next close to that person after that, and after that? And then create a whole one gigantic route of who's closest to the next person, closest to the next person, closest to the next person, to create a whole string of deliveries for Santa to actually reach some sort of destination. Okay, so that's what we're going to use our iterative macro for. We see 5,875 records, so we should have 5,875 iterations, right? We're going to find the next nearest child and keep running it again and again. So instead of building the same join tool 5,875 times, we can just build it once and save ourselves a lot of time. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep two window panes open to work with macros, as you really often should. One is more plugging your macro into your workflow and testing it, and the other workflow will represent the actual construction of the workflow. So I'm going to save this very quickly to my desktop, and I'll call this my Santa workflow. And I'll create another tab, and I'll name this my route macro. Okay, so here's my workflow where I'm going to test things, and this is where I'm going to build my macro. Okay, so what I'm going to do is first I'm going to take, we'll start constructing our macro, but what I'm going to put, I need to recognize first what data I'm going to pipe into my macro, right? Now, since we're essentially running the same thing 5,875 times, I really want to choose to make sure what I want to happen many, many times and what I do not. So typically, when you think of iterative, think of the logic that builds on previous logic, which builds on previous logic. So when I think about creating spatial points, I'll probably want to do that outside of my macro because I don't want to regenerate spatial points 5,875 times because recipient ID 1607 will continue to live in the same place every time. Rather, it's just the leg of the route that Santa is going to be going to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a Create Points tool and just create a spatial object where each child lives, okay? And what I'll also do, just to start off so we can just test our macro, is I'll take a small sample of data and just do the first 10 records so we can inspect it. Okay, so we'll let that render. We'll run a map profile so we can see what we're working with. So here's all of our points. And if you're not seeing this nice map background, you can always go up here and select your base map. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly copy all records with headers. And this is a nice little shortcut because I'm going to work with a little simple subset inside of my macro. I don't want to be testing on 5,800 records. I just want to start with the bare minimum and then start building myself up. So I'm going to go into here and paste this onto the canvas. So now when I add my browse tool again, you see it represents the exact same data. Okay. Now the one quick shortcut that I could teach you is if you right-click on this, you can convert this text input tool to a macro input. Okay. And now we're on our way. We're building a macro. Okay. As soon as I start to generate this input, I'll save my. Let me just save my file here. And we'll save it as route macro. Okay. If I were to go over here and insert my macro as it stands today, route macro, it looks like this, right? We've only built one macro input, so I get this little tool with just one input. So you can see one input here, one input there. Now, once the data flows into here, it's doing nothing, right? Essentially, this macro input just acts as an anchor by dropping this tool. And you'll see that even if I just add another macro output here, and I quickly save that, you can see that my macro over here updates to have an output. Okay, so this is why I like toggling between these canvases. And some of you might even undock these tabs into two different places so you can see them simultaneously. But in this case, I'll just toggle back and forth. Okay, so this is good. And the nice thing that I like doing about copying this data out is that when you look at the input, you'll want to make sure that the input is accepting data as it is expected to come into it, right? So if there's some weird option where your file might have different number of fields, then you have to spend time relegating how your macro is working with those fields versus just copying the way it is and pasting it in, okay? And you could also see if I just simply went to my interface tools and dropped in my own macro input, I could just do my own text input where I can enter freeform my own data if I wanted, or I could connect to that file of original database of gift recipients, okay? But as it is, I just took it as a text tool and just converted it over. It's just a nice quick way of taking care of things, okay? So we're well on our way, but remember what I told you is by default, nothing ever becomes an iterative macro if you don't set the workflow type. So we're going to go over to the canvas here, the configuration, and note that I do have to select the white space of the canvas to get that view. And we'll go to workflow and select iterative macro. And watch, as soon as I select that, that new variable is going to pop in down here, iteration number, right? An iteration number for us is really going to represent what stop number Santa needs to make, right? The stop 1, stop 2, stop 3. So each time it's run, we're generating essentially one stop, right? So we could choose any particular child to start with in this case. For me, we could have done some logic that says, one that's closest to the North Pole, but we'll just start with a random child, and what better than just to say whoever's on the top of the list, right? So we'll say, find the first record, right? And this is the first stop that Santa's going to make at this recipient at this Latin long, and this in Abilene, Texas, right? Now, I want to find the nearest to this location, to this centroid. So what I have to do is compare it to all the other records within this data set. So what I'm going to do is bring out a second sample tool, connect it in, and say skip everything but the first record, right? So what I'll essentially be doing is always just taking the top first record, and then the remainder of the records just go down here. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to use the find nearest functionality to compare what the closest locations are. Okay. So if you're new to this tool, the find nearest tool, it's a very simple and straightforward tool. Essentially, you're just saying, what is the nearest point to this set of points, right? Which one? I could update it to many different things, but in this case, I'm going to designate what spatial object, centroid from this data set, try to match to a centroid in this data set. And the nearest point to find, we're just going to find the next closest child, not the next closest 5 children. So we're just going to take the next one. And then what the minimum or maximum distance is. So this is essentially saying if one's not found within 20 miles, it's not a match. But what I really want to say is since I know I'm working with US data, I can just give it a gross overestimate, like 8,000 miles, right? I doubt we should ever have children that are that far apart between our stops since we're always finding the next closest, but it's just a good safety measure. So we'll go ahead, I'm going to add a browse to my tool here and run it, okay? And it looks like I need to ignore zero distance matches. Let's do that one more again. All right. So we just got to make sure that they're not in the same place. So it looks like that we have a near tie, almost identical tie, in fact. So let's do this. If they're at the same location, I'm just going to take a unique Latin long. I'm just going to update my data set here for a little bit. Random %. So I'm not working with everything inside the same town. And we'll just work with 1% of our records. And I'll copy all records with headers, and I'll just regenerate that macro input here. Okay. Should be a little nicer to work with. Okay. So here we have someone from Albany, New York, and the next closest person in this very small data set of about 59 recipients is in Waterbury, Connecticut. Okay. So in this case, we've already found where this person is. Since we're starting with them, they're going to be stop 1, and this person here in Waterbury is going to be stop 2. But what we need to do is include Waterbury in the next round so we know where to find stop 3, right? So I'm going to create 2 pieces of logic, and this is the logic that's usually mirrored in most iterative macros. 2 types of exit paths: exit when a certain criteria is met, or exit when it needs to go for another round of the iteration. So in this case, I've already matched this person who lives in Albany, New York, and they're done. They're going to be stop 1, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a select tool here. And I'm just going to get rid of all the universe information. I just really want information around that person. And I'm going to deselect all the highlighted fields quickly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to designate this person a stop number. So I'm just going to add a quick formula tool at a column called stop number. And I'm going to go into my variables. And you see in this new constants, I have this iteration number. That's not available, again, until you get to the iterative macro. So if you don't see it, you haven't set your workflow type. And I'm just going to add +1. Now, the reason that I add +1 is that I want this person to start on number 1, right? If I didn't, the iterations always start on 0. So for me, being Santa Claus, it might not make a lot of sense to start at 0. A lot of people start at 1. So this person will be stop number 1. And we can output them. They're done, right? We've already assigned them a stop. Now what we need to do is say what happens if they need to go for another round of iterations. So I'm going to select the inverse of what I did here, right? I just removed everything that corresponded to that recipient who's been matched. I'm going to match the Waterbury for another round. So what I'm going to do is deselect everything here. Okay. So this person is no longer a part of this data set. And I'm just going to remove any of that spatial information. And then I'll also rename any of these fields back to the original names of recipient ID, latitude, longitude. To rename, you could simply type in here in the rename column, but there's a nice shortcut to remove prefix, just like that. It'll make your life much simpler. So there you go. Our New York is done, assigned stop number 1. Recipient 803 is going to be stop number 2, but I'm going to keep him around so I can go ahead and loop it back and find stop number 3, right? And then once stop number 3 is found, I'm going to split number 2 out this output, and number 3 will go for another round. So it's a little bit of complication, but it's really not that bad once you dig into it a little bit more. So what do we need to do, right? For everything that needs to go around for a loop, if I just drug an output here and said loop back to here, it would only loop back that one record. I want all my records back. And by the way, one really helpful tip if you like working with iterative macros and helping understand which one is your iterative output, logically, I like taking my output and just kind of dragging it back a little bit just to make it look like, hey, this is the output that's just going to pipe right back in. Now, what we need to do is actually sign that this output goes here, okay? And we'll do that in a minute. But logically, at least from a simplistic perspective, I know this one's gone, right? And this one is going back. Okay, so what do I need to do? I need to essentially bring back my list from over here, okay? And somewhere in here, I still have that person from Waterbury, Connecticut, because they were an output for the match. So what I'm going to do is do a quick join and just find everybody who's not this Waterbury candidate. So I'm going to go in here and say recipient ID is equal to recipient ID, and I just want the right side, so deselect highlighted fields here, rename these without right. All right, do a quick run. And so here I have that Waterbury candidate. He did join between the two data sets, and here's everybody else. So now that Waterbury candidate should be unique, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and union those two outputs together. And I'm going to enforce my specific order here to make sure that my Waterbury sorts to the top. And there you go. So Waterbury, through the next round, is going to go back in and be pulled off the top for the first one, and everything else is going to go in and be compared to Waterbury. And once something matches, Waterbury is going to exit out as iteration 2, and whatever matches to it is going to go for another round. And I need to make sure that I reassign my iteration here. There we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and give it a test. So what I need to do first is go to View, Interface Designer, and this is something you'll always have to visit when working with iterative macro. Okay, we're going to go down to this little properties selection here. Now within macros, you can choose what kind of tool type you want it to appear as. That one looks kind of Christmassy. We'll choose that one. Choose what you want your iteration input and what you want your iteration output, right? So what's that asking? When I loop back, where do I want it to loop back to for the input? In this case, we only have one. You could, if you had multiple inputs, you'd have to assign it. But in this case, it's pretty straightforward. We're just going to choose our first input. Now, which one is our iteration output? Well, we have two outputs, but we know this one is the correct output. Now, you'll see by default, these tool names are really poorly labeled. So it might make sense to go ahead and rename these. So I'm just going to rename this one iterate. I'll name this one output. So when I go back to my interface designer and I try to choose which one is the appropriate one, it's not some odd name, right? It's iterate or output. And I didn't click off that tool, so it didn't generate there. So that should be better. There you go, iterate and output. So now we've created that connection that this should go to this, right? Which is really great. There are a few different things that need to happen though. So what is our maximum number of iterations? By default, it's set to 100, which works right now because we have 59 children in our data set. So it'll sit within the number of iterations since we're just finding one stop at a time. We'll use 59 iterations. But when it reaches 100, a few things can happen. One, it can error saying that there was a problem and your iterative macro couldn't complete, which is selected here. Or you could warn and just output leftover records, right? So you get a little message and then you'll get a little view of what that looks like. So we can demo that. I'll just shoot for something low so you see what that looks like. So we'll choose that, and all iterations will have the same output schema. So that's just saying that every time that we output to this new output, they have the same column names and same number of column names. If they didn't, you'd have to choose how to auto-configure them. It's either by name or position. So let's go ahead and save that really quick, and I'm going to run that workflow here. Now you'll see that we have two outputs here. One is the iterative and one is the output. And again, this doesn't really help us that much because we don't have any sort of labeling on them. So let's go back before we run this and make this a little bit more sensible for us. So I'm going to go to the output and add some sort of anchor abbreviation. I'm going to add an O for this one, so I know it's the output. For this one, I'll add an I. I'll save it yet again, jump over here, and now that macro looks a little bit nicer, a lot easier for us to use. I'll add a quick browse to the end and we'll run it. Now, the iteration limit of 20 was reached, so it can only run so many, and then the remainder were output through this data set, right? So that's what happens when we set some sort of limit. A certain amount runs, and then it ceases to run any longer. So you need to be really careful at making sure that your limit can contain the amount of records that you expect to go through your macro. So let's go back here and view our interface designer yet again, and choose how many iterations we want it to go for. I think if we ran the entire data set, it's roughly 5,000. We'll keep it at warn, so we just don't error, and then we'll leave it at that. Okay. We will go ahead and save. It'll let us know that we've changed our macro, and we'll go ahead and run it. All right. So there you go. Now I have an output of each stop that they should do, and they should be relatively close. So it goes Virginia to Maryland to Pennsylvania to New York to Connecticut to New York, right? I'm not saying it's going to be super optimal because they might just jump to different clusters and then have to go pick up some leftovers back and forth. But as a whole, it's a lot more streamlined than just simply finding them based on children's names as they might appear in the list. So yeah, and now we could have some fun with it. So if we wanted to, we could go into our spatial tools and connect the dots to create the actual path that Santa might be traveling. So I'm going to use the poly build tool here and create some sort of polyline saying connect the centroids together based on the stop number. So when I go to the stop, I have Santa's route around the US. Again, not particularly optimized, but certainly a lot better. And once we feel comfortable with that, we can start to open it up a little bit. Okay, so let's go with 10% of records. Now below you'll see here that I have a certain log that's running that you can find incredibly helpful, is how many iterations have been run and how many iterative records there are remaining, right? So how many are getting output and how many are continuing to iterate through and through. So in this case you can see that all of them got pushed through, and I generate a whole map for that. Okay, so that's a great way of enabling messages. If you really want to see if there's any type of error that's incurred throughout your building and you're running it through this workflow and you want to see what tools erroring within this, I could click back into the white canvas and go to my runtime settings, and there you'll see this selection for disable or show all macro messages. So things that might be happening within it now, you can see that a lot of different things are happening, right? I'm getting messaging from within it. So if you really want to troubleshoot at a finer level of detail, you certainly could do that. Okay. So there you have it. That's the high-level version of working with an iterative macro and building it. Now, if you want to, I'll pause there for a second, actually, and see if there's any questions. Okay, so now that we have this, right, and you know how to build an iterative macro, it makes sense just to figure out how we should share this, right? There's a number of ways. Essentially, when we build a macro, we constructed a tool, and if you'd just like to share the tool by itself, simply you just can use this YXMC and send that file to anyone. Now, if I wanted to share my whole workflow that includes my macro, that's a little bit of a different story because the macro is essentially embedded as part of the workflow solution, and it cannot be shared as simply a YXMD. What you'll need to do is you'll need to go to Options, Export Workflow, okay? And essentially, you create something called a YXZP right here, okay? It's Alteryx ending in a YX, and then ZP meaning zip. So we're zipping up everything within it. You can zip up the source file so that the file is contained as part of that workflow instead of being set to a path, and then also the macro can be contained within it as well. So I'm going to say that route macro can be included, US Santa stops can be included as well. This random records right here, this is actually a macro that's been built into the designer, but being that everybody has it by default, I'm not going to include it as part of the package. So I simply save it, show it in the folder, and now it's a lot easier to send to different places as a YXCP. Okay. Some other things that I can do that might be helpful along the way is go back to my interface designer within my macro and learn about the different things that I can do. So if I had used any particular logic that said how I got to this particular algorithm, I could include some sort of help file. In this case, I'll just use Google to demonstrate. Okay. I could add a custom icon if I just wanted to add a picture of Santa's face. I'll go ahead and save that yet again. So now when I go back to this macro and people might have questions about it, they could go to this question mark tab, this help. And sorry, I must have typed in my URL wrong. But you can go into here and open the help file, which should be google.com, so people have that to reference. So you might need to specify HTTP as part of that, which I did not, but that's something you could also do. Now, one of the trickiest things that you'll get caught up in when you're working with a macro is testing beyond the first iteration. No matter how many times I run this workflow, it's always pulling Albany, New York, okay? Which can be problematic, right? Because what happens if I want to simulate what happens when it loops for a second time around, okay? So one tip that I'll give you if you want to do this, and it's still not that great of a way of a testing, but it's certainly something, is what I'll do is copy the iterative output, right? So I'll copy all records with headers, say okay, paste it down here, and copy my entire workflow and create essentially a V2, right? This will represent my run 2. Oops. Keep deleting everything. There we go. Here we go. All right. And then I could use that to test. Since this was the output of the previous one, I could run it into this one and view how that data will look. Looks like it's not wanting to cooperate here. Duplicate. I can't have them name the same thing. That's right. I'll just rename my output. Okay, there we go. So now I could go in and see that my Waterbury, the second one, is going through. It's skipping everything else that isn't Waterbury. it's matching up, and we now see that Waterbury matches to New Haven. Waterbury is going out. And again, this one's where it gets kind of weird. The engine iteration will stay the same for this one, but we'll just have to trust that it would be in its second loop and be updating to one additional loop. And then we output to this list. And I could keep doing the same thing where I keep copying the output here and using it as the input for the next one. So it's a great way of troubleshooting your iterative macro and making it a lot easier for you. So I'll pause and see if there's any questions at this point. Okay. So one more tip that I'll give before we part away is just how to, let's say I'm Santa Claus and I always want to run this iterative macro as part of my standard tool palette. How would I achieve that? Okay, so we'll just check again where I've saved this at. So I have it as the route macro within my desktop folder. Okay, what I can actually do, if I go to my options, user settings, and edit my user settings, is there's a tab over here called macros. Okay, and you can see I've already got it set up, but I can reset it up again. Yours might be blank by default, but I can set up a path to always look to see where my macros are living. And it might make more sense to make a more specific Alteryx macros folder for your own use. But I will go in here and just select my desktop, select OK, and apply. Now, if I were to pan around here, I would have this macro file folder show up. And you can see that anything that's in my desktop folder is now available as my tool palette. Okay. Now, you can even go a lot further than this. Let's say that we want to call this a spatial function because Santa's using it for spatial analysis. What I can actually do is go and click into the white canvas or white space of my macro here. Oh. Click into my white space and go to workflow meta info and enter some information around it, right? So I can choose what tool palette that I want this to be a part of. So I can actually write this that I want it to be part of Spatial. And you'll have to make sure that your names match properly. So if I go over here, it is now in part of my Spatial palette. Now I can also add some sort of description here. What does it actually do? So I'll go back to my meta info. This finds the best route to visit and deliver gifts to all children. Save it yet again. If I go back to my spatial palette, click on it. Oh, it didn't show up here. I might have to get it to render. Oh, having a little different. I might be entering it to the wrong spot here. Let me see if I'm supposed to enter it here. There we go. Yes, sorry, entering description in the wrong spot. If I enter it up here, then it will enter into my tooltip properly. Now I have to make sure to save this again. Spatial. There we go. So a lot better. Okay. And then the nice thing about this meta info as well is if you wanted to add some sort of information around who the author was, especially if you're distributing it, it's a great way to share it. So that's your quick iterative macro build. I know we went pretty quickly there, but I'm willing to take some time and answer any questions if there's any. And if not, we'll see you next week. So I'll just hang on the line here for a few more minutes.